Okay, I'm starting over with Emile Durkheim because I got cut off. Emile Durkheim is, again, one of the founding fathers of sociology, and he was a functionalist, okay? So he drew heavily from Comte, and he criticized Comte because he believed that he was too vague and that he didn't really use a lot of scientific evidence in his research and his findings. Probably his most important book was The Division of Labor in Society. And in this book, what he did was he looked at the difference between pre-industrial and post-industrial societies. Um, Pre-industrial meaning agricultural, farm-based societies, and industrial meaning after the Industrial Revolution occurred, when we had people moving from the countryside to the city, taking on jobs in factories and mills, um, and we had a division of labor that was created, which means that instead of living on a farm where everybody around you is basically doing similar things, all your neighbors are doing similar things, the women are all doing similar things. When you went to the cities and you worked in industrialized cities, you noticed that people took on all types of specialized jobs and that there was a lot of differentiation in terms of what people did, labor, what they did for a living. And he talked about the type of harmonious operation of society in these two different types of worlds, in the agricultural life and in the industrial life. And he talked about mechanical solidarity, meaning the kind of tight, knit, close community, okay, of mostly kinship ties and familial ties of the pre-industrial agricultural days versus what he called the organic solidarity, um, more loose ties in industrial cities. So more people having different jobs, doing different things, but still relying on each other and depending on each other. For example, if you are a teacher, okay, you rely on the school to teach. But if you don't have, for example, janitors to clean up the schools, then your job is put in jeopardy because now you have to take on that responsibility of not only teaching, preparing for your classes and dealing with the children, but also cleaning the facility in which you are working. So he talked about this dependence that we have on other people in in the cities, in industrialized cities, that everybody needs to do their job in order for society to function. And again, this is a very functionalist, very optimistic kind of way of looking at society. As long as everyone does their job, then society will be maintained as a stable, functioning society. Um, Another hugely important research study that he did was his study on suicide. And he studied that suicide was actually a social phenomenon. We tend to think of suicide as a very individual, personal choice, but he said not so much. If we look at certain groups in society, we can see patterns, and we can see, for example, a higher rate of suicide amongst Protestants versus amongst Catholics. And what he said was that the reason behind that was that Catholics were more likely to live in a more tight knit, closely knit community versus Protestants who lived in a more individualistic life. Okay, so these are the two of his most famous works. Now, moving on from functionalist, we're going to go to the second perspective, which is called conflict theory. Okay, and this is again another macro um, perspective. Okay, so we're looking at society from bird's eye view. The founder of conflict theory was Karl Marx. So if you've ever heard of Marxism, he was the founder of Marxism, communism. Conflict theory states that um, that whole idea that society is generally functioning well, that's all kind of crap. Okay, There's a lot of inequality in the world. There is a lot of tension between upper classes and lower classes. Society is not stable at all. In fact, it's in constant conflict. So this whole idea that society is basically maintaining itself in a stable, functioning way, conflict theorists say that that's simply not true. So let's delve a little bit deeper into Karl Marx, although we're just doing a brief overview here. Karl Marx was an economist, a political philosopher, and he wasn't considered a sociologist, but nowadays we look at Karl Marx's works and we consider him very, very influential in the field of sociology. Karl Marx studied class conflict, specifically the conflicts between the bourgeoisie, which would be the upper class, the owners of the means of production, so the folks at the top that owned the factories and the mills, that hired people, and then versus the proletariat, who are the workers, the ones who provided the labor to produce the goods. Okay, so he focused on the exploitation of the workers. Remember, he was writing during the Industrial Revolution at a time where there wasn't a lot of regulation going on. There wasn't a lot of sanitation, um, regulations in the workplace. There wasn't a lot of laws saying, you can only work this amount of hours during the day, that you've got worker protection, that, you have to have a certain type of facility with meeting certain sanitary needs and safety needs. None of that really existed. So we had a lot of people dying on the job, a lot of people getting really sick, working, from, dusk till dawn. No workers' rights, no protections at all. Okay? So he was kind of responding to this and saying we need to stop this exploitation of the workers. Okay? Um, he also talked about historical materialism, meaning that society is, and all its values and its social institutions and the way that society functions is all basically a result of the economy and economic factors. So everything can be explained from this type of industrial economy, the economy that he was writing about at that time. And we'll go into this a little bit later. Secondly, we've got Max Weber. His last name is pronounced Weber. He responded to Marx in a very critical way. He rejected a lot of his theory that all social structure flowed from the economy. So everything about society, culture, our ideas, our religion, all of these things related in some sense to the economy. Okay? He kind of disputed that. And he said it's not just about the economy. There's other things involved that makes, for example, a person, in an upper class versus another. So not only did it matter that that you owned a factory or a mill, you didn't have to be just an owner, but you had to have wealth, meaning assets, not just an income. You had to have some kind of power, meaning that you had some kind of power over other people's actions, okay? And you had to have prestige, meaning your social standing had to have been respected. The best way to look at this is if we compare, for example, somebody who is a member of the Vanderbilt family or Kennedy or a Hilton, for example. Say the grandson of the Ted Kennedy. Okay, he's kind of born into this upper class. He's got that family name. He's got that wealth that's been passed down to him. Versus a newly rich person, like say a rapper. Okay, they don't have that same sense of prestige. So we can't classify all rich people into this one category like Marx did. And also Max Weber talked about the Protestant ethic. So he talked about Protestants versus Catholics, and the fact that Protestants were more individualistic versus Catholics, who tended to be more involved in tight-knit communities, and that it was because of this breakaway of the Protestant that flowed from the Protestant Reformation that actually brought about capitalism. Okay. Now, we have another sociologist, very, very influential. His name is George Simmel, pronounced Simmel. He really talked about groups, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, on our chapter on groups. But he talked about the difference between a group of 2 people and a group of 3 people, and it seems kind of like trivial, but once we get into it in our chapter on groups, it'll become a little bit more clear. The difference of the behaviors of people who are in a dyad, meaning a group of 2, versus a triad, meaning a group of 3 or more, and the types of the ways in which our actions differ based on how many people are in that specific group. And when we talk about groups, we mean, we could be talking about a family, we could be talking about an organization, etc. He also talked about industrialization, again, because he was writing at a time when the Industrial Revolution was happening. He talked about the impact of industrialization on class conflict between different classes, and also he talked about consumerism, this newfound phenomena whereby people buy things instead of making things, because before the Industrial Revolution, everybody made everything that they needed. Their clothing, their furniture, their medicine, all that was made from the home. And then that changed during the Industrial Revolution when people started buying things. So we talked about this newfound consumerism and the problems that could be associated with it. So your book also mentions Jane Addams. I'm sure many of you guys have heard of her. She was much more hands-on than many sociologists, so she wasn't just writing. She was actually doing community work. She founded the Hull House, which she was most famous for, which was a community center for the poor. But she also did do some writing. She wrote Hull House Maps and Papers, which was a methodological analysis of community field work and research and studies. So she was very influential in that sense, but she was never, because she was a woman, she was never fully accepted into the field of sociology. She was never considered, on the same level as, say, Max Weber or Karl Marx. W.E.B. Du Bois is considered a sociologist as well, and he's another social scientist that I'm sure many of you have heard of. He was most famous for, he studied slavery and he studied crime amongst blacks, specifically in Philadelphia, but he came up with a theory of double consciousness, this idea that, specifically for African Americans, but you could apply it to other groups today, that idea of African Americans having a self-identity, a self-image, how they saw themselves and how they believed, how they acted based on the way they saw themselves. But then at the same time, they had this idea of how other people saw them. Okay, so when they were in a public place and they saw whites looking at them a certain way, talking to them a certain way, they had this double image, this double consciousness of self-identity, of identity, really. So they had their own self-identity, and then they had the identity that was shaped by how other people saw them, which was often in a negative way. Okay, so we have C. Wright Mills, which is another famous, very, very famous sociologist. He was a Marxist, and he studied the white collar versus the blue collar, and he studied the power elite, which in short, the power elite was his idea of who runs America. He was talking about America, and he was talking specifically about the military, corporations, and the government.